Good afternoon and welcome to this Institute for Government webinar to discuss the public finance challenges facing the next government. Sorry we're a little late getting started. We had a slight technical issue, so I hope you've stuck with us. We'll get straight into the discussion. I'm Gemma Tetlow, Chief Economist here at the Institute for Government, and I'm really pleased to be joined by an excellent panel of speakers to help us talk about this topic. We have Trinh Chiu, who is Managing Director of Public Affairs at Ipsos, Andy King, who is a Specialist Partner at Flint Global and formerly member of the Budget Responsibility Committee at the OBR. We have my colleague Rhys Klein, who's an IFG Associate Director, and also the IFG's Deputy Chief Economist, Tom Pope. Please do start sending in your questions. I know lots of you already have, and thank you also for those who were questioning whether we were starting or not. We are now getting going. So do send your questions in. I'll put those to the panelists as we go along. But Tom, let me start with you. Can you just set out for us what is the public finance picture that will face the next government on the 5th of July?
Sure, thanks, Gemma. I'll just try to briefly lay out why it is that we and several others think that the fiscal inheritance is going to be so difficult and why there are going to be so many difficult decisions to be made. And I'll do that by focusing on the forecast for debt and the deficit over the next few years, because that's what matters really for fiscal sustainability and for both the Conservative and Labour fiscal rules. Debt currently stands at around 90% of GDP. That's pretty high by historical standards, and it's set to keep increasing as a share of GDP over the next few years for two main reasons. Firstly, the deficit is still set to be pretty high by historic standards, although coming down in the forecast over the next few years. And second, growth is set to continue to be quite sluggish, although the OBR is actually one of the more optimistic forecasters out there. So there are other forecasts that will make that even worse. However, debt is then set to fall as a share of national income in 2028-29, and that's important because both the Conservatives and Labour have a fiscal rule that requires that debt be on course to fall in the 5th year of the forecast, but it's only just falling. The margin there is only about £9 billion. I think what's really important here is it's only falling because the government has asked the OBR to make a set of policy assumptions about what's going to happen to policy over the next few years that we and others think are quite unlikely to materialise. There are some tax increases already penciled in, and the personal allowance and other thresholds in the income tax system are going to be frozen in cash terms rather than increasing with inflation as they normally would. Fuel duties are set to increase by 5p and then by inflation every year, even though no government in 15 years has put up fuel duties in cash terms. And then on the spending side, day-to-day spending is only set to increase by about 1% in real terms. And once you account for commitments made on health, defence, aid, and a couple of other areas that imply much bigger increases than that, for unprotected areas outside of that, we're looking at cuts of around 2% per year in real terms. And then investment spending is set to be cut even further, quite substantially in real terms. Both parties have announced some things in their manifesto. I'm sure we'll get onto that. But really, those were quite small fiscally. And actually, the big picture challenge facing whichever party comes into office will be the same. And that's this. Are they really going to commit to cutting unprotected services by almost 2% a year, given what we know about how much those services, like in the justice system in particular, in the police, in other areas, in local government, we know how much they're struggling from our performance tracker work and the work of others. And if they're not going to do that, does that mean they're going to increase more taxes, much more than they've said they're going to? Or are they not going to stick to their commitment to have debt on course to fall in the medium term? Absent a surprising improvement in the growth forecast, and even with some of the policies we're talking about, the parties are talking about, it would be surprising if growth were to be markedly improved. It's going to be really difficult for them to square that circle and find a way through.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. So Trinh, as Tom set out, there is a really difficult fiscal picture facing the next government and likely to be some really quite unpleasant trade-offs that need to be made between different things that we all want. From your polling, what sense do you get of what the public actually want? Where would their priorities be?
Okay, just to give some context, so I'll say a little bit about what's important to the public in terms of deciding which party they will vote for, and then a little bit in terms of what they don't actually want, and then why they are in favour of more taxes, and also the conditions under which they are in favour of paying more taxes themselves. So in terms of the issues that the public will tell us in terms of what will influence their vote, come next week is about the NHS. And we can see that being reflected in terms of the conversation and how the NHS stands in terms of the manifestos of all the parties. The cost of living, reducing the cost of living is a second thing. So the public is still very, very sensitive to the cost of living. And you can see that in terms of the main parties already coming out and ruling out tax increases, some of the personal taxes which will affect individuals, immigration. So, another thing that we've been hearing a lot about, and obviously immigration is quite tied to growth, which we'll talk about later, and it's predominantly still the kind of like conservative supporters who are more worried about immigration. And then the final one is about the managing the economy, which is about competence, which party comes across as being competent. And these kind of like top four issues have really not changed very much in the past year, and they certainly have not changed during the campaign. Now, in terms of what they don't want, what we have been doing is tracking the performance of Labour since 1997, and then obviously the Conservatives up to now. So we've got really, really good trend data. And what we find is that during the past 14 years, the whole of the past 14 years, what they have not wanted is the performance of the current government in terms of tax and spending. And over time, what we've seen is actually more and more people think that the current government is doing a bad job. So now we have 7 in 10 thinking the government is doing a bad job in terms of tax and spending. And that has been the theme, more people thinking a bad job than a good job throughout the whole of the 14 years. Whereas during the Labour years, you had kind of like the ups and downs. So, the Blair honeymoon went down and went back up again. That's what they don't want. They don't want any more of that. But you would have seen from the previous session that you had last week about public services, we have not seen this level of concern in all the times that we have done it. Have polled people. The level of concern is really, really high. And what people are worried about is also accentuated by the cost of living crisis. They think, I am now quite vulnerable, I need public services, but actually those public services have deteriorated to such an extent that I don't think those public services are going to be there for me when I need them. And that explains the kind of why, in terms of you have 2 in 5 in favour of increasing taxes, even if it means that they will personally end up paying for more, because they understand that the state of our public services is in such a bad place that actually it does require spending in order to lift those services up. And they are really, there's very strong opposition to cutting spending on public services as well, and in order to reduce taxes or to reduce borrowings. But the tax increases that they are in favour of is conditional. So when you ask people, they say, yes, I am willing to pay more taxes for public services, but it depends on which public services. It's not across the piece. So you find that NHS is still top in terms of what people would be willing to pay more taxes for. And then you've got this kind of like group in the middle, which is education, crime, policing, and defence. And the one thing which is probably explains why we haven't heard very much about climate during this election is actually what they're not willing to spend their pay more taxes on is actually to fund green climate change projects. The other condition for spending more on public services and paying more tax is reform. So they want to pay more, but that has to be accompanied by reforming our public services. It's not a case of just throwing more money at it. So I think, in summary, people are willing to pay more taxes themselves for public services because they realise the extent of work that is required to raise public services, but it does depend on which services that we are talking about.
Brilliant, thank you, Trin. Andy, let me come to you next. You've obviously previously worked both in the Treasury and at the OBR. What do you think the first days, weeks, months of the new government are going to look like? How will they be getting to grips with these issues? What will they be looking for from the OBR? I guess this will be particularly different if we've got a new government in, but perhaps even with a new mandate for the existing government, it would also be a sort of new start.
Okay, well, let me answer this as though the polling is correct and it's a new government. This is obviously, it's a big moment for the Treasury in particular. They will be working hard on the day one briefs, and they'll want to get off on the right foot with the new team being proactive, but at the same time having to deliver difficult messages. So I think there's perhaps three things that I'd highlight that I would expect to be part of that kind of initial conversation. As I say, the day one brief. The first is that the Treasury analysts will have been working hard at their best guess of what an OBR forecast would look like today. So they won't. I don't think they will have commissioned a forecast yet. So the Treasury kind of shadows the process, and there's lots of things that they can update by looking at what's happening in the world and in tax revenues and so on. But really, what they do is they try and advise the ministers, the Chancellor, on what the OBR might do about the really big forecast judgments, the ones Tom was mentioning about medium-term growth, where usually the summer involves a program of work. So the Treasury has an idea of what the OBR is thinking about and can steer the Chancellor in the right direction. No way of knowing from the outside whether that will be good or bad news, but the Treasury will be worried that the OBR is at the optimistic end of things. Tactically, they'd prefer to have a more pessimistic forecast at the start of the Parliament that gets better than a optimistic one that keeps clobbering them each time they arrive at a budget with another hole to fill. The second thing that they will have to do is the big reveal about what they know about what underlies the departmental spending totals that for the rest of us are just numbers with no detail of which departments will get what. I fear this is going to be tough reading. This is the place where having an OBR can't help the likes of the Institute for Government, Institute for Fiscal Studies understand what those numbers entail. And they will entail some difficult decisions. There will be some assumptions in there about public sector pay that may not be deliverable. There will be lots of information about how the reserve is under pressure and what they've been using it for to keep the show on the road. There will be information about how much the capital budget has been pre-allocated to ongoing projects, what needs to happen in defence. It's going to be a long list of things that will have to be dealt with before you get to the manifesto commitments. And this is obviously the thing that lots of people are worried about, is there's so much in the baseline that we don't know that it's less relevant to think carefully about new things that happen on top. Those two things all feed into what might be an early and big decision, which is when to do a budget and when and what sort of spending review that budget should include. I think the challenge here is actually that politics and policy making probably point you in different directions. I think politics would say, you've got to crack on, you need a multi-year spending review that sets direction for the Parliament, you need to get that out quickly, you've got momentum from potentially a big win in the election. Whereas kind of officialdom, policy making says you need to take time, there's some really difficult trade-offs to make, there's, literally you have to have conversations between ministers and the Treasury team to get these things right. So my guess, or what I would do if I was in the Treasury, is I'd be advising take two bites at it. Do a 1 year spending review to get 2025 plans out and take the time to think through the multi-year plan. But I'm an official with a cautious heart, and politics may point in a different direction. And then finally, what does it all mean for what they want from the OBR? I think in my experience, what chancellors wanted was probably three things. They wanted clarity, they wanted certainty, and they wanted predictability. So the OBR's choices about analysis are incredibly important for making a budget add up. It's their reading of the evidence that at the end of the day matters for the numbers that go into the budget. And so a chancellor will be taking decisions based on their own judgment, but also factoring in what they know, what they are told about what the OBR will put into the forecast. And with an agenda that focuses on supply side growth measures, that becomes very difficult because the OBR's reading of the evidence it determines the amount of fiscal space in the medium term. And so take something, the big ticket item is planning reform. And that, I would say, in my experience, is the most difficult thing to try and factor into a forecast. And in my day, the OBR never did. Always took a wait and see approach of if planning reform works, growth will be higher, and that will be factored into the forecast over time. The OBR has been trying to be more proactive on the supply side front. But that's on things like tax measures, where there's a lot of evidence of how change a tax rate, you change the amount people work. There is no elasticity, as it's known, for changing the wording of planning regulation through to growth, or at least not one that I'm aware of. And delivery matters as much as the detail. For those with scars on their back from the 2011 reforms, they looked an awful lot more impactful as they left the government offices than they did when they left Parliament, and then even less so as they were implemented at the local level. So it could be a difficult conversation. Back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Andy. Reese, the point Andy was making there about the political desire to get off to a strong start, perhaps a good segue to you. How important are the early weeks of the new government going to be in setting direction, and how can they set themselves up well for that?
Yeah, definitely really important, and agree with Andy on that. And I think there are some three key decisions that a government, especially a new government, if we get one, will have to make. The first of which was Andy's third, on what type of spending review will they go for in the autumn. And maybe unsurprisingly, we agree with you, Andy, in terms of the officialdom versus political temptation divide that you set out there. We agree with that, particularly because of the if it's a Labour government, the need to be able to sort of reform the spending review process around its missions will be really important, and actually one of the most consequential opportunities they have for doing so. And that decision will be affected by the call in the early weeks as to whether to rush for a multi-year review in the autumn or give themselves two bites, as you put it. So we would agree with that on the first front. The second is how does the government want to define and set out its top level priorities in the early weeks after government formation for the length of the Parliament. So the IFG earlier in the year published its Commission on the Centre of Government, and one of the key findings we had was that the Centre's ability to set top level whole government strategy early on in the Parliament, so that it can then roll into your public spending processes, your policy development processes, was one of its key failings. And so we think, and we argue, that a new government would be served well by making a really conscious effort to translate its manifesto, which, we shouldn't forget is a campaigning document first and foremost, into a set of priorities that have measurable outcomes attached to them and a set of underlying principles for governing that come along with them. We've called for something like a priorities for government framework, but there are different ways of doing this. But setting those priorities out in the first weeks can really pay dividends down the line in terms of how well aligned public spending is with ministers' priorities and with the plans of departments. And then lastly, and this one is really particular to if we get a new Labour government, is what does that mean for the governance and setup of missions across government? So what do they want to do in terms of the leadership within the centre, in terms of governance committees, the relationships between departments and other sectors? That will be quite determinative of the approach the government then takes to these really difficult fiscal questions, and how well aligned those tough trade-offs are to the quite lofty ambitions of the sort of missions rhetoric that we're hearing.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Rhys. I'll actually start with my questioning with one that's come in on Slido about fiscal rules. Because Thomas, you set out a lot of how tight and difficult these trade-offs are is in part related to what sort of fiscal rules the future government signs up to. And it's one area where both Conservatives and Labour have quite similar commitments in their manifestos. But Steve Schiffer's question is, what changes in the fiscal rules could facilitate more long-term investment to boost productivity? And I suppose, do we need changes in fiscal rules to do that? Perhaps, Trin, I'll just, if you have any views on this from your polling, do the fiscal rules matter to the public? Are they aware of them? Since Gordon Brown, they've seemed to be there as a sort of way of governments flagging to the public their fiscal credibility. Do you have any sense from your polling whether that's an important thing? Or
so the fiscal rules, if you ask the public, I don't, the public doesn't pay that much attention to fiscal rules, but what the public does pay a lot of attention to is the impact of the decisions that are made. So if you were to ask the public, about the fiscal rules around Liz Truss's, some of her announcements, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you, but they can tell you what the impact of those kind of decisions are on them, and what they see happening on the wider economy, and what that signals to the public is actual competence. It signals whether the government is, know what they're doing, is credible, and whether they can be trusted. So they pick up those cues, but they don't necessarily understand what the kind of like the minutiae of what those decisions are. Right. And ultimately, with Liz Truss, they blame the government.
Tom, do you want to comment on Steve's specific question here?
Sure. I think it's right that these fiscal questions have become really dominated by questions about fiscal rules and what is your exact headroom against an exact rule, and that isn't particularly helpful. And I think there are two things I'd say about the current set of rules, and in particular the debt rule, which is that debt has to be on course to fall in the 5th year of the forecast. The first is that it's not actually a particularly tight fiscal rule. It's pretty much the loosest one that we've had in the UK, going back to when they were formally introduced by Gordon Brown in the late 90s. We've often had requirements that maybe debt be on course to fall in the 3rd year of a forecast, or some requirement that day-to-day spending be covered by investment, but be covered by receipts. But the other feature of a debt rule is that debts, unlike a current budget rule that might say day-to-day spending must be covered by receipts, but you can borrow for investment. For debt, there's no distinction made between whether the thing you're borrowing for or increasing debt for is investment or day-to-day spending. And that does naturally then lead to an incentive that politicians have anyway to focus on day-to-day spending rather than investment. I think there are ways in which you could think about designing a different set of rules that would make it easier to make the case to borrow more to invest. I think we've generally been in a better situation in previous iterations of rules where the binding rule has been the one on the current budget. Labour would introduce a current budget rule, but the debt rule would be the binding one they would have to keep. I think having that distinction is helpful, but at the same time, fiscal rules are partly there to force governments to embrace difficult trade-offs. And I think what I would say is that there's no reason necessarily why a government needs to commit to debt falling in a particular year if their broader economic strategy requires something different. If they think they have a very strong case for why further investment is required to boost growth, to get to net zero, then they should instead be making the case for why it's the wrong rule, and think about maybe a way to design a different one. And I think we are in a bad situation at the moment where we're not really talking about what are those underlying fiscal objectives or broader objectives that the government wants to achieve. We're focusing on does a forecast move a little bit this way or that way? And therefore, is the government meeting this rule? We've almost forgotten why we've got the rule in the first place.
Andy, did you want to come on that as well?
Yes, I just wanted to, fiscal rules are a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. And what really matters is a sensible plan that is seen as such, and debt not to be on an unsustainable path. So we've seen lots of rule changes over the past decade, but only once did the bond markets blow up, and that was when the plan wasn't sensible, not when fiscal rules or anything in particular. And obviously the planner at the time was taking aim at economic institutions that the markets trusted. But one technical point for an IFG audience is that the measure of debt in the fiscal targets at the moment is debt excluding the Bank of England. And the motivation behind doing that was when something called the Term Funding Scheme was generating a very uneven path for the other measure of debt, known to OBR aficionados as full fat public sector net debt. Now, it was not chosen so that decisions about quantitative tightening would determine the scale of fiscal space in the medium term. So the case for switching back to the normal measure of debt, I think, is very strong, because there were sensible reasons for doing what was done, and those have passed. And now it's causing problems that don't need to be caused. But there's another thing about public sector net debt which is problematic for the plan that that Labour are bringing in, which is the assets that are netted off are only cash, which was again a decision taken for sensible reasons when the UK's fiscal architecture looked different. Since then, there are institutions like the British Business Bank, like the UK Infrastructure Bank, which could have large balance sheets with financial assets and liabilities of roughly equal measure. But it's only the financial liabilities that count against that debt target. So in a sense, they are unable to grow. And if you have a policy package, a growth package that is based on a national wealth fund and GB energy, then sticking with PSND as it has been used over the past 20 or so years is going to kind of strangle those institutions at birth. And you can see that has happened with the UK Infrastructure Bank. And so it's certainly an issue that they may want to look at, just how those fiscal targets interact with other plans and whether they are genuinely sensible trade-offs to limit the growth of those new institutions to keep a particular measure of net debt on a particular path.
That's a really interesting point, and clearly Labour have made quite a lot of the important role that those sorts of investment banks could have in the future, and other countries use them much more significantly than the UK does. Andy, in your view, do you need some kind of limit on the scale of those banks, or is the appropriate thing to do just to take them outside of the fiscal rules and let them grow as they need?
I think you need to manage the fiscal risk associated with those institutions. So one possibility is to do that via fiscal rules, which is essentially the way the default in the UK with the net debt target. If the fiscal targets were a broader metric, so there's a metric called net financial liabilities, which would count their assets, then their growth wouldn't be constrained by the debt target. You would still want their operations to be, not fiscally risky. That can be done in different ways. So I think an institution like the European Investment Bank has its own regulator. It's a kind of supranational institution. Something like KfW in Germany, which always comes up in policy conversations in the UK. Why can't we have a KfW? Is regulated like a bank, but in a special way. The regulations have been amended and made appropriate to a public bank. So you have to manage the fiscal risk, but not necessarily via a fiscal target.
I'll take another couple of questions that have come in online about possible new or reformed taxes. So both from Anonymous, one asking, is there scope for a government to create new streams of tax revenues? And then also another question asking about views on global wealth taxes, and whether the UK should support that, whether that offers opportunities. Tom, shall I come to you first?
Sure. I think that there are, as has been already spoken about, both main parties have ruled out increasing the main taxes, and they do account for getting on between 2/3 or 3/4 of tax revenue. But there are other taxes you could increase and new taxes you could introduce. Road charging or road pricing is one thing that wonks love to mention, and politicians run as far from as they can. Labour has talked about replacing business rates with a slightly different system of taxing commercial buildings. And there are also other smaller tax revenues that haven't been ruled out. One thing that George Osborne, when he was in the Treasury, was always keen of was increasing insurance premium tax, because no one really seemed to notice, or their premiums were going up for lots of other reasons, so he didn't get the blame. And there are lots of different ways that you can increase things like that. Wealth taxes is a really interesting one, and one that we've done quite a bit of work on, actually. If you look internationally, see that there aren't many countries that do have a wealth tax, so a sort of percentage of your stock of wealth charged each year. Not many that raise a lot of money from them, and that tends to be because they tend to end up having lots of carve-outs for the assets that actually make up most of wealth, like housing and pensions. So once you take things away like that, if you have quite a high starting threshold, the amount you can raise is a little bit less. And there are also challenges in how you implement a brand new tax like that, which I'd encourage those who want to learn more about to look at our paper on the IFG website. But certainly, I think more broadly, how we tax wealth is a really important thing for the next government to grapple. And that doesn't necessarily need to be just stocks of wealth, but also income deriving from it. So we tax capital gains quite a lot less than we do other forms of income, and there's definitely scope for reform there. And we have made changes to how we tax dividends, so that that's no longer so much out of place. But there certainly is an opportunity, I think, and a long overdue opportunity to review how we tax capital in the UK, whether or not that means a wealth tax, that could certainly raise a decent amount of revenue, even if we're not talking about tens of billions of pounds.
And Trent, from your polling, are there any types of taxes that the public are more or less in favour of?
Yeah, so the taxes that the two parties have kind of like offered up in terms of their commitment are not to increase them, are the ones that the public agree with. So they are the ones that the public would resist if any government tried to increase. The one that they probably would want to add to that list as well is council tax. So the public is quite anti increases in council tax. So basically all the taxes that that affect them personally. In terms of so that leaves us with the capital gains tax. So that's the one they're less bothered about. So the government wanted to increase, and that would be one of the ones that they could go for. And obviously income tax for high earners is another one, because it doesn't affect the fairness and the equity, which is really important, how people look at the tax system. Tobacco and alcohol duty is another one they don't really care about. And stamp duty overall, because stamp duty affects a small proportion of people. So for those people, obviously it's very important, but overall the public doesn't care that much about. The ones that they resist, because it is about fairness, is inheritance tax. They do not, even the people who are not touched by inheritance tax, still see inheritance tax as something that's really unfair, even though they themselves may never have to pay it. There is something about penalising people who have saved and have been responsible, and then taxing those people. Fuel duty, obviously. We've seen lots of parties going on about how friendly they are towards car drivers and that. So fuel duty is another one that people see as unfair, and it's mainly because if you have to drive because you can't, public transport is so rubbish, or it doesn't it's not available, And then the wealth tax. So we did do a big piece on wealth tax a couple of years ago. And out of all the taxes, and we called it different names as well, because we thought actually, that might bias people in terms of how they see a wealth tax. And there was, even when we called it a different name, there was a resounding support for wealth tax. The public was really behind wealth tax. But when you get into the nitty gritty, and we were able to do that, in focus groups. So got those. You had like a whole day devoted to it. You could get somewhere quite far. When you got down to nitty gritty in terms of the threshold, who should pay it, should it be households, should it be individuals. People got a little bit more. It becomes a little more complicated. But the principle of the wealth tax is one that they do welcome.
Thank you, Rhys.
Thanks. Yeah, while we were on tax, I thought I should come in to make a quick related point, which is a question we've been doing some thinking about the IFG that has not played as prominent a part in the election campaign for understandable reasons, which is about how tax policy making is handled in government as opposed to spending review processes more widely, which we think will be quite an interesting, important question for the government after the election. Taxes are largely excluded from the same rigor and process that spending goes through as part of the spending review in terms of Treasury's challenge on value for money and its alignment to government priorities. We think that the difficult fiscal context we've been talking about in this event means that the government will have to be more comprehensive after the election than spending reviews often are. And so seeing if there are various ways to include particularly tax reliefs in wider consideration of expenditure might be quite a useful way to increase the sort of strategic scope that the government has to think about some of these questions. And as I say, not really something which we're talking about loads now, but after the election might become.
Right, Andy.
I just wanted to one reflection on like the past 10 years really is that although taxes don't go through a spending review, they go through a big process for each budget. And the fact that the public resoundingly doesn't like taxes that it pays themselves, but does like taxes that other people pay, does affect how things are put together. And the commitments not to raise the big taxes have led to an increasingly complicated tax system with an increasing number of small new levies on things that hopefully people don't notice. You have a situation where local governments are declaring bankruptcy despite the fact that they have a tax they can raise themselves. And these kind of really difficult and unpopular decisions are the ones that are possibly going to have to be confronted as all the other difficult decisions and trade-offs have to be made. Continuing to make the UK's tax system even more complicated is not a recipe for improving growth performance.
Just before I move on to some other topics, Andy, I'm going to pick up on a couple of questions that have come in really related to your points around redefining debt targets and things. From David Robinson at Market News International, you've already answered his question about including or excluding Bank of England in the debt measure. But he also asked whether a fresh wave of PFIs or variants of that public-private partnership model would stay on balance sheet this time around or be gameable as they were under the New Labour period. So that's the first one. I'll let you answer that.
Excellent. Even more niche for the IFG audience. I think that PFI is accounted for in a different way nowadays, and that it's very difficult to design it to be off balance sheet. I think various things have changed, in particular the way leases are accounted for, which has had a big impact on departmental spending plans. All that means is that guarantees are the thing that is very attractive now because they are off balance sheet, whereas PFI was back in the day.
Right, thank you. And the second question comes from John Geeve, who asks whether redefining the rule in the way you talked about, bringing the Bank of England back within the measure, how much difference would that make, either in the near term or permanently, to the kind of constraints imposed by the rule?
I think on the March forecast, it made £16 billion of difference in the target year. It will not make a difference forever. So once the size of the Bank of England's balance sheet is back at whatever they think is the right size, and they stop selling gilts, then the two measures come into line again. The reason why it's a sensible thing to go back to the other measure of debt is that the other measure of debt captured the effect of the Bank of England buying those gilts at higher than face value as the quantitative easing happened. And the reason why the ex-debt measure, the ex-Bank of England measure rises or falls more slowly or rises more quickly, is because that thing that's already been recognized in one measure moves from Bank of England to central government. It's just a mad reason to constrain fiscal choices.
Thanks very much for that clarification. I wanted next to come back to this point about reform of services that you mentioned, Trin. First, I'd like to ask you whether you have any sense of what types of reform are the public looking for, given the low levels of trust and confidence in government. What do they need to see to be convinced?
So I think when we did a really interesting thing actually, where we asked the public to describe public services in 1997, and then we asked the same questions again recently. And what we find is that obviously the two things that are similar at the top is that public services are underfunded and bureaucratic. But when you look underneath, the language has really changed in terms of the how people see public services now. You know, friendly, competent, accessible has been replaced by unaccountable, unfriendly, really quite difficult to access, quite hard to get hold of. So I think when the public is thinking about reform, they're thinking about some of the kind of like the underlying things in terms of how easy it is for them to access the public services, which is at the moment, obviously with the waiting lists and things like that. It's also about joined up. The way in which public services are quite silo. It's coming out. There was also the kind of like the use of technology. It's also another theme that's come out, that they want technology to be used more widely, but they're also really scared as well as to kind of like the use of AI in terms of, you know, in health, make services more efficient. And then I suppose the other final thing, the strong thing that came out in terms of reform is actually the local delivery. So delivering public services from the centre was something that they're definitely not in favour of. They want public services to be tailored, much more tailored at the local level, not delivering the same thing across the country, regardless of local context. So definitely integration, local delivery models, and also the use of technology.
Thank you. Reece, can I come to you? How can government approach serious reform programmes? And perhaps one specific question, certainly one of the things that the Conservatives have pointed to as a possible cost saving would be cutting civil service headcount. Is that possible? How could you go about doing that?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the second and then I'll broaden out to the first. On the civil service efficiencies, it's definitely possible to cut the civil service, and there is there are more and less responsible ways to go about trying to do that, which we've written lots of papers about for those that want to go into lots of detail. But a few things to say on the Conservatives' pledges. There are still two versions of this that have been going around. One that has been said it will be used to fund the 2.5% uplift of GDP for defence spending. Obviously, where that's been used more arbitrarily to align that as what would fund that, that is wrong. You know, you could cut the whole civil service and not get the amount of money you'd need to get to that, and then ministers would find they didn't have any officials. But even as the more realistic version of that I've seen, which has a 3-point-something billion pound saving over the course of the Parliament assigned to it, is a more plausible number, but it's less reflective on the recent history of governments trying to make efficiency savings from the civil service, which is that it's really hard to cash it out. It often creates new costs elsewhere in the system, in things like demand for consultancy services, for example. And also the sort of real lived recent history of trying to cut the civil service is it's just quite hard to do. The Chancellor's headcount cap was put into effect October last year, and at both of the data releases that followed that, we've seen the civil service continue to grow, despite the fact that it was stated government policy not to do so. And that was for understandable reasons. They're hiring asylum decision makers in the Home Office to try and clear the backlog, for example, or staff in MOJ and prisons to try and staff crowded, and understaffed prisons. But what it does mean is that it is really difficult to make cuts of the size that the Conservatives are saying they would like to make, i.e. to get back to pre-COVID times. And so, a degree of skepticism is needed when sort of engaging in that debate. On your first point about the broader approach to reform, we think, well, there's a couple of points here. The first is the point we started with, which is often where reform plans fall down is where there's a lack of coherent strategy set from the centre on the one hand, or where the centre tries to do too much of the delivery on the other. So getting that balance right that I started with talking about, kind of a clear set of priorities from the centre and then empowering departments to get on with delivery is a good starting point. And then lastly, the other argument we've made in terms of reform plans has been where they exist outside of the scope of the government's approach to public spending, they are obviously doomed to fail often, right? So the example we give often is levelling up. One of the difficulties with the levelling up programme that, Tom, you've written extensively about, was that the length of time the government waited to define it meant that you had the SRs 20 and 21 that were left to try and budget for this quite complicated and ambitious reform programme without meat on the bones of what it would mean. And then when the white paper came after those, it was left trying to fill in the blanks to the budget allocations that had already been made. So if the government is serious about that kind of public service reform, it needs to align it with these tough spending decisions right from the get-go. Otherwise, it's risking making the same mistake as previous governments.
Thanks very much. I'll take the anonymous question, which has the most votes in our Slido at the moment, which asks whether you panelists would agree that with the statement made by Paul Johnson that there's been a conspiracy of silence between the two main parties about the level of public sector cuts they'll impose over the next Parliament. Tom, I'll start with you.
I think there has definitely been a conspiracy of silence in terms of how difficult the decisions are going to be. I'm not yet convinced whether that will necessarily manifest itself in cuts for public services or whether it will actually look like a bit more borrowing and a bit more taxation and some combination of those. One thing that we've done is looked at previous spending reviews, and this pattern of penciling in quite tight plans in the future. This isn't the first time it's been done, but what we found quite consistently over the last 15 years or so is that when a government actually comes to making the hard decision of where those cuts need to fall, it almost always finds some extra funding. And in the last couple of spending reviews, it's been in the order of 20 or 30 billion pounds that it's found to alleviate those cuts or prevent them. So conspiracy of silence in terms of the borrowing numbers or the tax numbers, all the spending numbers, they can't all be right, but I'm not sure it's necessarily on the spending that it will fall.
Andy, what's your take on this?
I thought Tom's answer was excellent. There is just a lot that needs to happen within the baseline to keep the show on the road, and if improving public services from what we've heard the public and from the public and what we've heard can see in your performance trackers, if improving public services is part of what the next 5 years are going to involve, and improving public infrastructure, which in places is literally crumbling, then yeah, something has to give.
Trin, is this conspiracy of silence working on the public? Do they think that they can have everything, and is that going to make it difficult?
No, I don't. No, they don't. They literally don't believe it. They think that taxes will go up. So most of the public think taxes will go up, regardless of the which party, whether it's Labour or the Conservative. And when they look at the manifesto, they don't think that add up either. They think that if Labour comes in, they're going to see tax rises or more borrowing. And if the Lib Dem or the Conservative were to implement their manifesto, then they think that actually those two parties would just drop some. They would just drop some of the stuff on there. But nobody believes that the sums add up, which is why it's a bit of a missed opportunity, really, for some of the parties not actually getting some of this mandate up front for the hard decisions that they need to make later on.
I was just going to make a similar point to Trin, or ask her if she agreed that it was a missed opportunity, because we've looked at, certainly in our work on tax policy, about how governments can deliver difficult reforms, even in those taxes that Trin highlighted that people are less keen on paying. And I think that there is a real opportunity, certainly when you have at the start of a parliament a few years to bed things in, to really make the case for what those higher taxes or reforms and improved taxes are actually going to deliver, and really set out, a plan. We've said that the next government should set out a tax strategy that lays out not all of the policies it's going to implement over the next 5 years, but a sense of the direction that it wants to go, and a rationale for that. And I think that there was a real opportunity, and perhaps there will still be after the election, but certainly would have been beforehand, to really make the case for, yes, some taxes are going to go up because we want good public services, or we want to deliver these other things that we're going to. Now, I suspect this is partly the naive official style view that we tend to take, and there's a good reason why politicians have not done it. But it does feel like a missed opportunity in terms of governing effectively after the election.
And do you think that's right? I mean, it does sound like they're not necessarily getting the electoral boost that they might have hoped from the conspiracy of silence here. Oh, you're still on mute, Trin.
Yeah, I think they've really cornered themselves, because what's happened at the moment is the level of trust of politicians is so low. When we measured our veracity index, it basically went down. We've had to extend a lot of our graphs during this couple of years, normally downwards. But the level of trust is so low that actually, because if Labour comes in, which the polls are pointing that way, then I don't think Keir Starmer wants to do that. I mean, after spending so much time convincing the public that Labour is not scary with the economy, and he has achieved that. Labour is no longer seen as being scary, and you would trust them with the economy, and you would trust them with taxes. That actually, to then reverse some of those commitments would actually really damage trust, which is already quite low, and that honeymoon period would be over very, very quickly, I would imagine.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, and sorry again for starting a little bit late on this. But I just wanted to thank very much Trin, Andy, Tom and Rhys for joining us for this discussion today. Thank you all for joining us. Video and sound of this event will be available on our website and on YouTube straight after the event if you missed anything. Please do stay tuned to the IFG. Next week, we will be running our live blog in the run-up to and aftermath of the election with all of the very detailed geeky IFG type content you would expect on what formation of government looks like and the key things facing the new government as they come in. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.